Hola, ¿cómo está? As some would say, it's great to be with you today and right now. This is Anthony at the periodic table of history. We take our time machine in this channel and go back and find interesting characters from history. We go through this space-time continuum vortex so that we can reach the past and learn from the past and become better people now. So that's our goal. So let's imagine a world that's different from our present world, since the Great Flood utterly destroyed the past world. So we have to imagine a completely different atmosphere. Now, when scientists drilled into the amber, little bubbles in amber, they found out the fossilized amber, they found out the atmosphere was different in the pre-flood world. Everything was different. Ferns grew 10 feet long. So we have to imagine everything differently in this pre-flood era. And it might as well be Mars or some other planet to us, because we can't really think the present is the key to the past in this. We have to think of a completely different world, and we're going to talk about Mahalaleel. We're going to talk about him in light of the Hebrew record, the Babylonian a little bit, and the Indian record. That's what we're going to get into. So hopefully you'll come along with this ride. It's going to be a great ride, and we're going to learn. Mahalaleel is the 5th generation, with Adam being the 1st generation in the Hebrew record. Now, he lived from 3719 to 2824 BC. That seems like a pretty long range, and it is. But let's get to him in Genesis 5. And Canaan lived 70 years and begat Mahalaleel. That's where we pick him up from. And he does have an interesting name, the Shining One of El, because that's derived from 2 Hebrew words. One that is praise and another one that is God, or praise or shining one of God. There are other scriptures that relate to Mahalaleel. I'll put them up on the screen so you can read them. You can pause the video at any time so that you can get to those. Genesis 5:15 through 17, we get his age, 895 years old. Now he's just a young pup compared to the other people, like Noah at 950 or Methuselah at 969. We also have his chronology without the numbers in 1st Chronicles, and then Luke reiterates his genealogy to Jesus, so Luke is reiterating Mahalaleel in Luke chapter 3. So that's up there. But let's go into our periodic table of history. Okay, here we see the overall scene, and we're going to be up here in the very ancient region. Also, we can look at the Sumerian kings list a little bit, and over here in India. Those should be very interesting to us. So we will zoom up on Mahalaleel. He's the 5th one. Let's see if we can get him. Mahalaleel, yeah, there he is. So we got him first shot. That doesn't always happen when I zoom into this thing. Okay, Mahalaleel, let's right-click that, and we will make that yellow. It's fun to back out and see how big his life was. So we'll put an arrow out there, an arrow that's small enough for us to see the beginning and the end. There's the beginning and end. So we notice that Noah is this blue rectangle here, and the yellow of Mahalaleel. Yeah, Mahalaleel lived past the birth of Noah. He knew Noah. That is amazing. And so let's zoom over, because we have, well, we'll zoom out for a second. We can get our perspective back again. And then let's zoom in here to this Babylonian list, because there were 8 kings and then Utanapishtim, which would make 9. And so we have, instead of having 10 or 11 patriarchs, we have 8 or 9 here in the Sumerian kings list. So there's 1 and 2, Alulim, Alalgar. We'll go down, 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 get to the next city. Inminluana, Inmingalana, Dumuzid. So there are 5. So this Mahalaleel could be that whatever that name was that started with a D. I mean, I can hardly even pronounce it. And here's another one. Anyway, it might be somewhere in there. The Sumerian kings list is real interesting because it is in Sumer, and we know that Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldees. So these Sumerian cities are from the place that Abraham came from. And that's where we get the Sumerian kings list, and we have the flood legend there, and then we also have the flood legend in the Hebrew region. That's what makes that so very, very intriguing. Now we will go a little bit farther ahead. Farther ahead, we're going to go to India. I'm going to put that circle there just so you can know where we're headed to. And can we find anything else about this? Yes, we can go into the book of Jubilees, and you can read that, but we can find out who Noah's wife was. That is an interesting little detail there. See, I put in bold, Dinah. Mahalaleel took unto him to wife Dinah. If you read on in that scripture in Jubilees, now Jubilees is kind of like Genesis or like the Torah according to the Ethiopians, and this would be a Ge'ez text from the Eritrea and Ethiopia, that region. But we have the Watchers down here. That's kind of interesting in there, but you can read through that. Another thing that's interesting is it says he took the daughter of his father's brother, so his niece. That's kind of interesting. Up until now, we have seen that whoever the patriarch was marrying their sister, which would not be a problem genetically at this time because they're so genetically pure. They aren't copies of copies of copies of copies and degraded like we are now, but they had very good DNA without all the destruction that we have. But we still think it's a little weird as far as incest goes. And then we have here this daughter of his father's brother. So that's a little bit of branching. So that tells me that the population is really increasing right here. That's a little bit of a clue right there that might be interesting to us. And you know, the only reason we think incest is wrong is because God gave the law to Moses and told us that it was wrong. But that was down in 1445 BC, somewhere around there. Remember, this is way before that. This is fifth generation of Adam, including Adam. So it's interesting about Noah's wife, the name. Watchers, I've seen the word watchers as that's come up in Daniel, the book of Daniel. And you can see a lot of these ancient texts that talk about watchers. I think they're pretty unclear to us. It gets off into some pretty bizarre topics, you know, aliens and weird and Nephilim and all kinds of weird stuff. Raphaim, those are, you know, so that we don't need to go into that. There's enough people getting into that kind of stuff. I'm more interested in how the application of history can impact our lives. Another book is a little bit out there, is the book of Enoch. We get a little bit of data if it's authentic, and I do have my reservations against the book of Enoch, another Ge'ez script from Ethiopia. It's another book, and I'll put that up there. First Enoch 83, 3 and 4. You can read through that, but just notice a few things in there, like the description of the flood. Supposedly Enoch is prophesying about the flood in the future, and then we get this description of Mahalaleel. I had laid me down in the house of my grandfather Mahalaleel when I saw any vision. See, so he's in the past, he knows Mahalaleel, and then he's looking into the future. The flood hasn't happened yet. And there's some interesting verbiage here that's just talking about mountains were suspended on mountains. Earth swallowed up great abyss. See, that is apocalyptic type verbiage in that. But it's in the book of Enoch. You can take it or leave it. If you're not into all these esoteric texts, that is just fine. It is pretty far out there. There's a little bit of flat earth stuff in there too, so in the book of Enoch. So we might not want to get caught up in some of this stuff, but as far as just looking at these ancient scriptures, you know, part of that is of the book of Enoch is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, little pieces of it that we see. So it's just interesting to see what the people wrote about that time, like the flood, and about that pre-flood time. You can get a little bit of a glimpse into that because he's a character. If it's authentic, it's kind of interesting. But anyway, long life is another thing I like to talk about. Did say he was just a youngster because Noah lived to be 950. Mahalaleel only lived to be 895, right? So maybe he got a black widow spider bite, or he got stung by a bunch of killer wasps or something. Anyway, the long life theme, it goes through a lot of different cultures. So we'll visit Indians. The Indians have a myth about the Vaivasvata Manu. And this was a Manu reiteration that survived the flood. Now, we can glean a little bit of information from this because now in Hinduism in India, they believed in reincarnation, so they had these various iterations of Manu, and there's 7 of them. It's interesting that there's 7 of them because we have 8 flood characters from Babylon, and then Uttanapishtim, which is Noah, which we say 9. So we have these 7 iterations of pre-flood people by the Indians, and then in Genesis we have 10 for our Adam to Noah type scenario. So that's kind of interesting when we're seeing a little bit of degradation in the information. The information is being lost as we're getting away from the Hebrew record. It goes from 10 down to 8, maybe down to 7 here. But the Vaivasvata Manu is very interesting. It's supposed to be, living, within an era of time, and their eras of time are really long, like so long they didn't even write down the eras of time. And so that we have the actual number in the Hebrew record that says 895 years for Mahalaleel, but then we have this word ageless from the Indians. And this Vaivasvata, he was a king before the Great Flood. I have read the Rig Veda, and it does talk about this. Now, this stuff is very polytheistic, so don't get into it if you can't handle that. That is definitely a warning. God said, I'm a jealous God, and there's only one God, and Adonai is the one God. So when you get into the Indian myths, their main themes are about their God, Shiva, and then they have a lot of these legends about the flood stories. That's what the Rig Veda was about. It was about the Great Flood and a flood that happened after the Great Flood, where a hero came in and saved everybody from dragons, which is interesting because of the dinosaur aspect. In these Indian legends, they blend the character of Adam and Noah just the same as the Chinese did. And how they do that, here's a picture, and it depicts 7 figures with Manu in the ark. And that sounds very much like what the Hebrew record says about Noah and his wife, 3 sons and their wives, which would be 8 people. But when we look at this picture, look at how they are not making this picture from the Hebrew record. They're making this picture from the Vedas and the Puranas. They're the books of the Indians. And they call it Manu and the 7 Saptarishi. And these 7 Saptarishi recreated all of life. And they also had seeds that they stored in this boat while it went through the flood. So there's all these artifacts that you find in these legends. The boat was perched after the deluge on the top of the highest peak of Himavat. And that was their iteration of, it's sort of like Garden of Eden and the Himalayan mountains. They put those together and they made them spiritual at the same time. But they have the mountain that their ark rested on for India was Nau Bandhana. And notice the first part of that name, Nau. It sounds like Noah again. So we have the Chinese Fuxi, his wife, is Nuwa. And then we have this mountain that's named Nau, the mountain where Manu landed on. this mountain Bandhana in the Himalayas. So we have these artifacts that when we study this stuff, we can see that somebody that's forgetting information like the gossip game and they get away from the original, and then they're losing some of the technology, some of the artifacts, and then trying to rebuild it and then piecing it together, but it still has some of those same pieces. It's very fascinating. So let's keep on going and keep on learning more. You can learn a lot about that stuff in the Mahabharata or the Vedas or the Puranas, but they are, like I said, very polytheistic. So here's a little piece of the Mahabharata. Manu was endowed with great wisdom and devoted to virtue. See, doesn't that sound like the Hebrew record? It's God finding that Noah was perfect in his generations and deemed him worthy to be saved out of the whole human race that was killing each other and hurting each other and destroying each other and being evil. So it's just interesting to see those really amazing artifacts. It talks about Manu's children and the ones that survived and so on and so forth. 50 other sons on earth that a bunch of them perished because they were angry at each other. All these artifacts that are so interesting. So let's go into that just for a second. We'll zip up into periodic table of history and we can see that Manu Vaivasvata. Now they put him at 1600 BC. So we can see that there's a great discrepancy between this great flood happening maybe in 2250, 2500. The Babylonians have it at 2007, 2800, and the Egyptians have it at 3000 BC. Well, here, this Manu Vaivasvati is here at approximately 1600 BC. So I think that is actually very late. That's very, very far off. But that is where we go. India, Bharata dynasty, and according to scholars, it's a mythical history. But interesting how the myths start having all these artifacts that are so very similar with these others. So we'll zoom back out and we can get that perspective. And again, I'll say we went here to India. We went over here to Babylon and we went here. Well, we can still see the yellow lines just barely. And I'll put that off of there where we went. Well, thanks for watching thus far. It was amazing to find out a little bit about India and Babylon and the Hebrew record and how it's kind of linked together, and to give us a tiny bit of a feel for that pre-flood world using other sources, even if it is the book of Enoch, which I'm not so very comfortable with. But hopefully this satisfies a little bit of your curiosity about Mahalaleel, and I hope we start viewing the world in a different way. It is fun to view the world in a different way. I hope you go away with faith, hope, and love. Those are the three great characteristics that Paul the Apostle talked about. Well, you can click up here on another video. You can click the channel name. It'll take you to a list of other videos. And of course, have a great weekend. Dios te bendiga. God bless you. And I'll see you in the next video.